The first thing I noticed was the folder. It was sitting on my grandfather's nightstand when I walked into his hospital room that Tuesday morning. A manila folder so old it had turned the colour of weak tea, its edges soft and furled like the pages of a book left in the rain. He had his hand resting on top of it, not the way you rest your hand on something you've set aside, but the way you hold something you've been waiting a long time to give away, deliberate, almost possessive. His knuckles were pale from the pressure. He didn't look up when I came in. He was staring at the window at the November sky, doing what November skies in northern Ohio always do, threatening without delivering, grey and heavy and still. "You're late," he said. I set my coffee on the windowsill and pulled the chair close to his bed, the same chair I'd been pulling close for 3 weeks. It made the same scraping sound on the linoleum. By this point, that sound had become a kind of ritual. My arrival, his acknowledgement, the settling in. "The 71 was running behind," I said. "Detour on Caldwell." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "The 71. You're 34 years old and you still take the bus." "I like the bus." "You like avoiding things." I didn't argue. He wasn't wrong. My grandfather had a gift for that, for saying the true thing so plainly that you couldn't even be offended by it, because it arrived without cruelty, just observation, the way a doctor might note a symptom. He'd always been like that. Walter Marsh. The most honest man I'd ever known, which is why what he told me over the next 9 days shook me in a way I'm still not sure I've fully recovered from, even now, even after everything that followed. His name was Walter James Marsh, and he was dying. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, diagnosed 8 months earlier. He was 79 years old, and he had held on with what his oncologist privately described to my mother as remarkable stubbornness. That sounded exactly right. Walter had always been stubborn, not in a combative way, but in the quiet, load-bearing way of old houses and old trees, things that resist by simply refusing to yield. "How did you sleep?" I asked. "Badly?" He shifted against his pillows. He'd lost about 30 pounds since the diagnosis, and the hospital gown made him look smaller than he'd ever been, smaller than the man I remembered from my childhood, the man who built things with his hands, who smelled like sawdust and coffee and winter cold, who once carried me on his shoulders through the Halcroft County Fair when I was 6 years old, and told me that from up high, everything looked like a problem you could solve. "Elliot." He said my name the way he always said it when he wanted my full attention. Both syllables given equal weight, a kind of verbal handshake. "I need to tell you something." I looked at him. He was still looking at the window. "I need to tell you something I should have told a lot of people a long time ago." He paused. His jaw worked. "But I was a coward. And then I was ashamed of being a coward. And then so much time had passed that I told myself it didn't matter anymore." He finally looked at me. His eyes were the same pale blue they'd always been, even now in all this diminishment. "It matters. I need you to know that it matters." I felt something shift in the room. Not the air exactly. Something under it. The way the atmosphere changes before a storm. Not yet raining, but the light different, the quality of silence different. "Grandpa," I said, "what's in the folder?" He looked down at his hand on the folder, almost as if he'd forgotten it was there. 46 years of my life, he said, give or take. I should tell you who I am before I tell you what happened, because I think it matters. My name is Elliot Marsh. I'm an investigative journalist. At that point, I worked for a regional publication called the Great Lakes Ledger, a staff of 11, offices above a dry cleaner in downtown Cleveland, readership that was enthusiastic and loyal and not particularly large. I covered environmental issues, water quality, industrial pollution, regulatory failures. I had won 2 regional press awards and been shortlisted for a national one that went to someone at the Chicago Tribune, which was the correct outcome, and I was mostly at peace with. My grandfather was the reason I covered what I covered. Not consciously at first, but Walter Marsh had been a civil engineer. Water systems, specifically. He'd spent 30 years designing municipal water infrastructure across the Midwest before his career ended in what my family described in the vague and evasive way families describe painful things as difficulties. I'd grown up hearing that word applied to that period of his life, the way you apply a bandage, covering something, not healing it. He never talked about his work. Not the specifics. He'd tell me about the principles of hydrology, about how water moved through systems, about the particular satisfaction of designing something that served a community invisibly, silently, for decades, but never the specifics, never the companies, never the names. I had always assumed it was professional modesty. I know now it was something else entirely. He didn't tell me all of it that day. He told me the beginning. "Do you know the name Hargrove?" he asked. "Hargrove Environmental Solutions?" He made a sound. "That's the one." I knew it the way anyone in my field knew it, peripherally, with mild professional distaste. A mid-sized environmental consulting firm based in Columbus, Ohio. Regulatory compliance, environmental impact assessments, water quality consulting for municipalities. A decent reputation, nothing spectacular, nothing troubling. The founder, he said, Desmond Hargrove. He said the name with the careful, controlled neutrality of someone who has spent decades perfecting the suppression of a very large feeling. Desmond Hargrove was my business partner. He looked at the window. 1978. I was 31 years old. I had been working for the Ohio Department of Public Works for 4 years, Water Infrastructure Division, and I had developed a new approach to municipal water treatment, a filtration and monitoring system, more efficient and significantly cheaper than anything that existed at the time. He paused to breathe. Breathing cost him more now than it used to. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you it was genuinely original. The kind of thing that happens maybe once in a career, if you're lucky. A real idea, a complete idea. He stopped. He was looking at his hands. Desmond was a friend. We'd known each other since graduate school. He was smart, charming. He had a gift for people that I didn't have. I was the engineer. He was the salesman. 2 halves of something functional. A pause. He was best man at my wedding. Ruth. My grandmother, who had died of a stroke 11 years earlier. I thought of her photograph on Walter's dresser at home, a young woman laughing at something outside the frame, dark hair, eyes that curved into crescents when she smiled. We started a company, Marsh and Hargrove Water Systems. I put in the technical work, the patents, the designs, the engineering specifications. Desmond handled the business side, contracts, relationships, the municipality negotiations. It was a good arrangement. We had our first contract within 6 months. His voice had a different texture now. Something between pride and grief, the specific ache of remembering something you loved before it was ruined. It was the best time of my professional life. I was building something real, something that would be there after I was gone, doing good work, quietly. That's all I'd ever wanted. He reached for the water cup. I handed it to him. He drank slowly. 1981, he said. The partnership dissolved. The way he said it, formal, clipped, like reading from a legal document, told me everything about how much it still cost him. Desmond brought in investors I hadn't approved, renegotiated terms I hadn't seen, moved assets I hadn't known were movable. By the time I understood what was happening, I was out, not fired. It was more elegant than that. I was bought out at a valuation that was criminally low, presented with paperwork that my lawyer told me was fair, and walked away from the company I had built with, he paused, choosing the word carefully, with almost nothing. He stole it, I said. He stole it, Walter confirmed. The patents, the designs, the client relationships, everything I had made, he took and renamed and grew into what eventually became Hargrove Environmental Solutions. He looked at me. He took 40 years of my working life before they had even happened. He took what I was going to build and built it himself, with my blueprints under his name. Why didn't you fight it? I did. For 2 years, I hired a better lawyer with money I didn't have. I filed complaints with the Ohio Engineering Board, but Desmond was better connected than I was. He'd built relationships I hadn't noticed him building. City council members, state officials, regulatory bodies. My lawyer received a job offer from one of Hargrove's associated firms and withdrew from my case. The Engineering Board investigation was closed with no findings. He looked at the window. And then there was Caldwell Falls. Something in his voice changed. In 1983, he said, there was a contamination event in Caldwell Falls. The municipal water supply. Several hundred people became ill. 7 died. I felt my chest tighten. The system installed in Caldwell Falls was mine, my design. My name was still on the original permits because the buyout had been legally complicated. By the time the investigations were complete, my name was on the failure. But the system didn't fail, he said, and his voice cracked for the first time since I'd arrived. Just a hairline fracture, quickly controlled. I want you to understand that. The system I designed did not fail. There were modifications made after the buyout. Maintenance decisions, monitoring decisions that cut costs, that Desmond's company made under his management. I wasn't there anymore, but my name was still on the original documentation, and Desmond's lawyers were very good at clarifying whose name was where. You were blamed, I said. I lost my engineering license. I spent 6 months under criminal investigation before the DA declined to prosecute. Not enough evidence, they said, but the investigation itself was enough. I couldn't get work. Ruth almost left me. Did you know that? I shook my head. She didn't, she stayed, but there were 2 years where it was very close. He was looking at his hands. I went to work for a hardware supply company. I drove a delivery truck for 8 years. I built furniture in the garage. I was finished. Professionally, financially, publicly, everything I had made was gone. And what remained was the wreckage of a reputation that wasn't even accurately named. The room was very quiet. Down the hallway I could hear the distant sounds of the hospital. A call bell, soft footsteps, someone's television. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. He picked up the folder. He held it out to me. "Because Desmond Hargrove is being honored," he said. "Next spring, the American Water Works Association Lifetime Achievement Award." His voice was entirely flat. "For his contributions to municipal water safety." I took the folder. "And because I'm dying," he said, "and I spent 46 years being a coward about this, and I need you to do what I couldn't." I didn't open the folder in the hospital room. I rode the bus home with it in my bag, pressed against my hip like a secret, which it was. I opened it at my kitchen table at midnight. What was inside was remarkable. For a man who had been told he was finished, who had spent 4 decades ostensibly defeated, Walter Marsh had never stopped documenting. Copies of the original patent filings from 1978, the water treatment system he'd designed, with his name, and only his name on them, the original partnership agreements for Marsh and Hargrove Water Systems, the 1981 buyout documents, and even without being a lawyer, I could see that the valuation was not just low, it was fraudulent based on financial statements that had clearly been manipulated. A chain of correspondence between Walter and Desmond from 1981 to 1982, formal, increasingly hostile, Desmond's letters written in the smooth Teflon prose of a man who had learned to communicate without admitting anything. But Walter's letters were detailed, specific, naming dates and decisions and alterations made to the Caldwell Falls system after the buyout. And there was a letter from Walter to the Ohio Engineering Board dated November 1982, 8 months before the contamination event, warning that Hargrove's post-buyout maintenance decisions were compromising the system's safety. It was stamped received. There was no evidence of any response. He had tried to warn them. And they had done nothing, and 7 people had died, and his name had been on the paperwork. At the back of the folder, clipped together with a rusted paperclip, 2 pages of Walter's handwritten notes dated 1987. Calculations showing that the specific failure mode identified in the EPA report was inconsistent with his original design, that it could only have occurred if specific modifications had been made post-installation, changes that Desmond's company had made, changes that Walter could identify in the EPA report itself if you knew what you were looking at. Walter had solved it, alone, in his garage, 4 years after the fact, with no resources and no authority. He had done the work and had no one to give it to. I closed the folder. I put my hands flat on the table. I didn't sleep that night. By the time the sky started to lighten, I had made a decision. Not a hot decision, and not rage, not impulse. A cold one, the kind that settles into you and becomes structural, load-bearing. The kind you don't make dramatically but discover, the way you discover you've stopped believing something, gradually and then all at once. I was going to take Desmond Hargrove apart, not for me, for Walter, for Ruth, who had nearly broken, for the 7 people in Caldwell Falls who died because a man prioritized cost-cutting over the safety specifications of a system he had stolen and didn't fully understand. For the 46 years of silence my grandfather had worn like a second skin, I was going to do it right. I was going to do it completely, and I was going to make sure that when it was done, there was nothing left to rebuild. Part 2, Building the Case. I went to Nora Whitfield, my editor of 6 years. She was sharp, skeptical, protective of the ledger in the way that good editors are. She had an instinct for which battles were worth fighting and which ones would cost more than they were worth. I told her what I had. A 40-year cover-up, corporate theft, possible negligence contributing to deaths. I told her my grandfather was involved, which she noted with the careful, measuring look I expected. "You know this is a complication," she said. "It's not a problem if the documentation holds up," I said. She looked at me for a long time. "If you find a story, we publish the story. If there's anything you can't be objective about, you pull yourself, and it goes to Renata." A pause. "I'm sorry about your grandfather." "He's still alive," I said, more sharply than I intended. "I know I'm still sorry." The first thing I did was background research on Desmond Hargrove. He was 77, born in Columbus, 1947. Civil engineering degree from Ohio State. 1969. Graduate work in environmental systems. That's where he and Walter had met. He had founded Hargrove Environmental Solutions in 1982, the year after the buyout of Marsh and Hargrove Water Systems, the year before Caldwell Falls. The company had grown steadily over 4 decades to about 340 employees and revenue in the range of $40 to $60 million. Solid, unglamorous, profitable. The AWWA award announcement was on their website. Desmond Hargrove, Lifetime Achievement Award for decades of contributions to municipal water infrastructure safety and sustainability in the Great Lakes region. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I started pulling corporate records. The patents that Hargrove Environmental Solutions had filed in 1982 and 1983, the ones that formed the technical foundation of the company, were substantially identical to Walter's 1978 filings, reworked by whoever Desmond's patent attorney was, adjusted enough to create the appearance of distinction. But the core, technical approach, the key innovations, the specific solutions to specific problems, they were Walter's. I was not an engineer, but I had been an environmental journalist for 8 years, and I could see it. What I couldn't do, not alone, was prove it. For that, I needed an expert. His name was Dr. Ogenekaro Adaeze, Caro to everyone who knew him, a water systems engineer at Case Western Reserve University who had been an occasional source for me over the years. He was in his 50s, meticulous, with a dry sense of humor that emerged unexpectedly and always landed. I walked him through the documents in his office on a Friday afternoon. He asked for 2 hours. I went to get coffee from the department vending machine. When I came back, Caro was sitting back in his chair with his hands folded over his stomach, which I'd learned was his thinking posture. The 1978 patents are substantively original, he said. The approach to multi-stage filtration with embedded sensor monitoring is elegant. Actually, this Walter Marsh knew what he was doing. He tapped Walter's handwritten 1987 notes. These calculations are correct. The failure mode described in the EPA report is consistent with a specific post-installation modification to the monitoring thresholds. If those thresholds were lowered, to reduce the frequency of maintenance alerts, which is how you cut operational costs, the system would continue to function normally under most conditions but fail to catch gradual contamination events. He looked at me over his glasses, which is exactly what happened in Caldwell Falls in 1983. Could that modification have been in the original design? No. The original design has explicit specifications for those thresholds that would have prevented this failure. Whoever lowered them understood the system well enough to operate it, but not well enough to understand the safety implications. Caro, I said, if I needed this in writing, send me the documents formally. I'll prepare an expert assessment. A few weeks, he looked at me. This is a real story. I know. Be careful with it. Personally, I mean. Stories like this get under your skin. He had no idea it was already under mine. He was worse when I visited that Saturday. The deterioration was steady and incremental, but measurable if you were paying attention, which I was. His hands were less steady. He was eating less. But his eyes were still sharp. I told him about the patents, about Caro. He listened without expression, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. There was a man named Gerald Tusk, he said. Operations manager Desmond brought in during the restructuring. He's the one who would have been making the threshold decisions. Is he still around? I don't know. I made a decision 40 years ago not to follow any of them. A pause. That was cowardice too. It was survival, I said. He looked at me with an expression that said he was willing to let me call it that, but wasn't entirely convinced. There's something else you should know. The civil suits were settled confidentially. Hargrove's company paid about $400,000 across all the families, split 7 ways, non-disclosure agreements. The families couldn't talk. No admission of liability. He shook his head. Desmond Hargrove never personally paid a cent, never acknowledged anything. His name appeared nowhere in the settlement documents. He reached into his nightstand drawer and produced a small white envelope, unsealed. "Don't read it now," he said. "Take it. Read it when you need to, when you hit a wall and you're thinking about giving up." I started to ask what was in it. "Just take it," he said. I put it in my bag. I hired a private records researcher named Felix Drummond, an ex-paralegal with a gift for finding paper trails other people had spent effort obscuring. I gave him 3 targets: the corporate dissolution of Marsh and Hargrove water systems, the asset transfer to what became Hargrove Environmental Solutions, and the employment history of Gerald Tusk. Felix came back in 3 weeks with a report that confirmed my worst suspicions and added new dimensions. The corporate dissolution of Marsh and Hargrove had been handled by a law firm called Whitmore and Breck, Columbus. That firm had subsequently handled significant legal work for Hargrove Environmental Solutions over the following decade. The attorney who had represented Walter in the buyout, a man named Robert Gallies, had accepted a position at a company that shared board members with Hargrove Environmental Solutions. I read this twice, then called Felix. The attorney who advised your source to accept the buyout terms subsequently took employment with an entity connected to the acquiring party, Felix said, with the calm of a man who had seen most human behavior and was startled by very little of it. Make of that what you will. What I made of it was, the fix had been in from the beginning. This had not been an opportunistic theft. This had been planned. Gerald Tusk had died in 1999. Initially it felt like a door closing, but Felix had found something, a 1996 deposition transcript from an unrelated civil case. In it, Tusk had been asked about his decision-making authority at Hargrove in the early 1980s. There was a specific exchange. Q were the threshold parameters of the Caldwell Falls water monitoring system subject to any adjustments during your tenure. A. Long pause. I don't recall specifically. Q. The Caldwell Falls system experienced a significant failure in 1983. A. That failure was investigated and attributed to design deficiencies in the original installation. Q. But you don't recall whether any modifications were made to the system's monitoring thresholds? A. I don't recall the specifics. No, he was lying. The pause before "I don't recall specifically" was 3 seconds long, according to the court reporter's notes. But a dead liar couldn't be deposed. The question was whether anyone else knew. Part 3. The Living and the Disappeared. I drove to Caldwell Falls on a Wednesday in January. It was a 2-hour drive through the kind of Ohio winter landscape that seems specifically designed to encourage existential contemplation. Flat, grey, the fields dusted with old snow, the tree lines reduced to pencil sketches against a white sky. Caldwell Falls was a small city of about 18,000 people, the kind of place where the downtown was surviving but not thriving. I was not going to approach the families. They had signed NDAs, which were legally binding and which I was not going to ask them to violate. What I was there for was the public record, the city council archives, the local newspaper morgue. The Caldwell Falls Courier Register archives were housed in the basement of the public library. The archivist was a woman named Josephine, 71, who had lived in Caldwell Falls her entire life. She remembered 1983. 7 people, she said simply, without dramatics. The Aldrich family lost a mother and a son, Father Brennan from St. Michael's, and old Mr. Van Camp from Sycamore Street. She paused. The water tasted strange for weeks before anything official happened. People noticed, they complained. The city said the tests were fine. She pointed me toward the archive boxes. In the October 1983 letters section, one caught my attention. A resident named Pearl Maddox had written, "Before we accept the conclusion that this tragedy was caused by faulty design, I think the City Council owes us an explanation for why the Water Department received 2 separate complaints from residents about unusual taste and odour in the water supply in March and April of this year, months before the outbreak. And both complaints were logged and then not investigated further." Pearl Maddox, I wrote the name down. She was alive. It took me a week of searching through county property records and voter registration lists to find her. She was 84, living on the east side of Caldwell Falls with a caregiving aide. I had called ahead. She agreed to see me. Pearl Maddox was small and white-haired, and sharp in a way that age hadn't dimmed. She was in an armchair by the window with an electric blanket over her lap, and her eyes sized you up quickly and didn't bother being subtle about it. "I wrote that letter in 1983 and nobody cared," she said. 43 years ago, why are people caring now?" "Because I think there's more to what happened than the official record shows," I said. "And I think you may have known that too." She looked at me for a moment. "Sit down," she said. "My husband was on the City Water Committee at the time," she said. "Not an official position, it's got just a citizen advisory thing. He knew the engineers who worked on the installation. One of them, a subcontractor, came to our house in April of 1983. Nervous. Said he'd been doing routine maintenance at the treatment facility and noticed that the monitoring settings had been changed from what the original installation specs called for. He didn't know who had authorized it, but it worried him. Did he report it? He tried. Called the company, Hargrove. They told him the settings had been updated per new operational guidelines and they'd send documentation. She paused. They never sent it, and when his contract came up for renewal in June, it wasn't renewed. June 1983. The outbreak started in August. What was his name? I don't remember his last name. First name was Terence. Terry, my husband called him. He moved away after the outbreak. I drove back to Cleveland with the windows cracked and the heat up, the cold air on my face, and in my chest the particular feeling of a story assembling itself, pieces clicking into place, the shape becoming visible. I needed to find Terence. Felix found him. His full name was Terence Burge. He was 78, living in Tucson, Arizona. He had left Ohio in 1984 and had never returned to water systems work. He had spent the rest of his working life in construction management, far from the industry that had, in his own words when I reached him by phone, broken something in me. The first call was tentative. I introduced myself, explained the investigation without revealing everything. I asked if he remembered the Caldwell Falls system, and there was a silence. "Who told you my name?" he asked. "I'd rather not say just yet. I can tell you the person who pointed me in your direction has no reason to harm you." Another silence. "I've kept my head down for 40 years, he said. "I have grandchildren. I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm sorry about what happened in Caldwell Falls, but I don't see what I can do about it now." "Mr. Burge," I said, "I need you to understand something. The man whose design was blamed for that tragedy, he's dying. He spent 46 years carrying the responsibility for a failure that wasn't his. His engineering license was revoked, his reputation was destroyed, and the man who was actually responsible is about to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award. I paused. I am not asking you to put yourself at risk. I am asking you to tell me what you know, and I am hoping that after 40 years, you might be ready to say it. He was quiet for a long time. Let me think about it, he said. He called me back 2 days later. We talked for 3 hours. In the spring of 1983, during routine maintenance at the Caldwell Falls facility, Terence had accessed the monitoring system's configuration logs and found that several threshold parameters had been adjusted. The changes were small in absolute terms, but significant in their practical implications. They had raised the bar for when the system would trigger alerts, meaning lower-level contamination events would not be flagged. He had noticed, because the current settings didn't match the original installation documentation, when he raised it with Hargrove Environmental Solutions, a regional manager named Philip Vaught had told him the thresholds had been updated per a technical review, and that documentation would be provided. The documentation was never provided. When his contract came up for renewal in June, he was not renewed. Budget restructuring, they said. Did you report this to the EPA during the investigation? I asked. I tried. I left messages. I never spoke to a human being. I called 3 times and was finally told the investigative period for public input had closed. A pause. I didn't have a lawyer. I didn't have resources. I was one man with maintenance notes, and on the other side was a company with lawyers. You still have the maintenance notes? The question sat in the air for a moment. I kept everything, he said. I kept everything because I never stopped believing that someday someone would ask. He scanned and emailed me 41 pages of handwritten maintenance logs from the spring of 1983. They showed clearly and contemporaneously the discrepancy he'd identified between the original configuration specs and the current system settings. They showed the date he had raised the concern, April 14th, 1983. They showed his follow-ups and their non-resolution. The contamination outbreak began in August. The threshold modifications had been in place since at least April, and possibly since 1982 when Hargrove took over operational control. Caro's formal expert assessment arrived in mid-February. 12 pages of dense technical analysis, its conclusions unambiguous. Walter Marsh's original design had been engineered with safety thresholds that would have detected and flagged the contamination event in Caldwell Falls. Those thresholds had been modified post-installation. The modification was inconsistent with the original design specifications and would have required deliberate intervention. The failure was most accurately attributable to those modifications, rather than to any deficiency in the original design. I now had the original patents showing Walter's authorship, the derivative filing showing Hargrove's appropriation, the fraudulent buyout documentation, Walter's warning letter from November 1982, a corroborating witness with contemporaneous documentation, and an expert assessment concluding that the official attribution of the disaster was wrong. What I did not have was a direct connection between Desmond Hargrove personally and the decision to modify the thresholds. Philip Vaught, Terence Burge's contact, was dead. Gerald Tusk was dead. The chain of direct responsibility had its links, but the top link, Desmond Hargrove himself, and was where the paper trail became indirect. I needed something more. It was Nora who suggested the approach. You need someone who used to be on the inside, she said. A company that's been around 40 years has a lot of alumni. Felix compiled a list of 19 people who had worked at HESR during the period 1982 to 1990, were still alive and could be located. Most didn't respond, a few declined. 3 gave unrevealing conversations. And then there was Sylvia Okafor. Sylvia was 63. She had worked at HES from 1984 to 1993 as an administrative coordinator, the title that covers the person who actually knows where everything is and keeps everything running, the backbone of any functional office. She had left in 1993, she told me in our first call, when the environment became untenable. She was living in Columbus, retired, with a son and 2 grandchildren. When I explained what I was investigating, she was quiet for a very long time. "I signed a non-disclosure agreement when I left in 1993, she said. My heart sank. "I understand." "I've spoken to a lawyer about it several years ago when I was reading about whistleblower protections, purely out of curiosity." A pause that was not quite as casual as she was presenting it. "My lawyer told me that NDAs that require you to conceal illegal activity are generally unenforceable." I waited. "I was the person who processed the internal memos," she said slowly. "All of them. For 9 years, Philip Vaught filed operational decision memos to Desmond Hargrove's office for approval on anything above a certain cost threshold. In 1982, there was a memo about what they called system optimization protocols for properties inherited from the previous entity. The Caldwell Falls system was specifically mentioned." She stopped. "I know what I saw. I have remembered it for 40 years because of what happened afterward." "Did you see that memo approved?" "I saw Desmond Hargrove's initials on the returned copy, D.H. in red ink. He always used red ink." I felt something settle in my chest, final and heavy and exactly the right shape. "Mrs. Okafor," I said, "would you be willing to meet?" We met 3 times over 3 weeks. Between meetings, she consulted her attorney again. By the 3rd meeting, she had confirmed for me, on record, the following. Desmond Hargrove had been directly involved in the decision to modify the monitoring thresholds on systems inherited from Marsh and Hargrove water systems, including the Caldwell Falls system. The decision had been framed internally as a cost optimization measure. Philip Vaught had proposed it. Desmond had approved it. This was documented in internal memos that she had personally processed. She did not have copies. They were company property, and she had not retained them when she left. But she knew they existed, remembered their content with the specificity of a person who had long understood their significance and was willing to describe them in detail. And she was willing to go on record. "I've been quiet for 30 years, she told me at our final meeting. I was quiet because I was afraid, and then because I had a son and I was afraid for him, and then time. And then one day I was old enough that being afraid started to seem like less of an excuse." She looked at me. "Those people in Caldwell Falls deserved better than what they got. Their families deserved better. So did the man whose design was blamed." "His name is Walter Marsh," I said. "I know," she said quietly. "I always knew there was a Walter Marsh. I saw the name in the early documents. I understood, after Caldwell Falls, what had happened to him. I just didn't know how to say it." She paused. "It's a terrible thing, to know you should have done something and to not have done it." "He's still alive," I said. "For now." Part 4. The Story. By late February, I had what I needed. Expert verification of the patent appropriation, Terence Burge on record with contemporaneous documentation, Sylvia Okafor on record describing the memo chain, Caro Adesi's expert assessment, Walter's original documentation including the warning letter, the deposition transcript of Gerald Tusk with its telling hesitations, the record of Robert Gallies, Walter's compromised attorney, and his subsequent employment. Nora reviewed everything with our media law counsel, a careful woman named Diane Pasternak. The review took a week. Her conclusion: the story was legally defensible. We could publish. Journalistic practice required giving Desmond Hargrove the opportunity to respond. I sent a detailed list of the specific allegations we would be publishing via certified communication to Hargrove Environmental Solutions, addressed personally to Desmond Hargrove, requesting a response within 10 business days. The response came in 7. It was from a large, expensive law firm in Columbus, 4 pages. It threatened legal action for defamation. It characterized our reporting as a coordinated campaign of false allegations motivated by personal animus. It demanded we cease preparation of any story and preserve all related documents. I read it twice and forwarded it to Diane. "Classic intimidation response," she said. "Nothing in here they can actually enforce." And the fact that they went straight to legal threats rather than substantive denial of any specific allegation is telling. That's what I thought. It also tells us they're scared. This is a man who's never had anyone come this close. We pushed the publication date forward by 2 weeks. The piece ran across 6 pages in the Ledger's digital edition, with print following the next morning. The headline was "A Stolen Design, 7 Deaths, and a Lifetime Achievement Award, The Hidden History of Hargrove Environmental Solutions." We laid out in full the history of Marsh and Hargrove water systems, the original patents, the fraudulent buyout, the conflicted interests of Walter's attorney. The founding of Hargrove Environmental Solutions on technology it hadn't developed. We laid out the Caldwell Falls timeline. Walter's warning letter in 1982, Terence Burge's identification of the threshold modifications in April 1983, and Hargrove's stonewalling. Sylvia Okafor's description of the memo chain. Caro Adazi's expert conclusion that the original design was not responsible for the failure. The settlements, the NDAs, the attribution of blame to a man who had been warning about the risk for months. At the end, I had included a short section titled simply, "The Man Who Was Blamed." 4 paragraphs about Walter Marsh, who he was, what he had built, what he had lost. I wrote it last, very late one night, and I was not entirely dry-eyed while doing it. By noon, the piece had been picked up by the Columbus Dispatch, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and the Associated Press. By 3 o'clock, the American Waterworks Association had issued a statement saying it was reviewing the selection process for the Lifetime Achievement Award in light of recent reporting. By 5 o'clock, Hargrove Environmental Solutions had released a statement calling the allegations categorically false and announcing an intention to pursue legal action. Then my phone rang. The caller ID said, "Walter, hospital." My heart lurched. I picked up. It was my mother. "He wants to talk to you," she said, and her voice had a quality I couldn't quite read. Not grief, not alarm, something more complex. "He's been following the news online." A pause. "Elliot, he's crying. I've never seen him cry." I got to the hospital in 40 minutes. He was awake when I came in. His laptop was on the rolling table across the bed, the Ledger piece on the screen. His face was different. I had seen his face in many states over the past months. This was a state I hadn't seen before. He looked released, like a man who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just finally been permitted to set it down. My mother and my Aunt Phyllis were in the chairs by the window. Both looked at me when I came in and then looked away, giving us the room, in the emotional sense, even though they stayed. I sat in my chair, the chair that scraped. "I read it," he said. "I know. You didn't." I didn't know you were doing all of this. I thought you'd look into it. I didn't think you'd... You gave me a folder, I said. You gave me 46 years of documentation, and you told me to do what you couldn't. What did you think I was going to do with it? He made a sound that was between a laugh and a sob, a wet, breaking sound I had never heard from him before, and it landed in my chest like a stone dropped in still water. Ruth, he said. She should have known. She should have gotten to hear it said. She knew you were innocent, I said. She stayed. She knew I was innocent, he said, but she never knew anyone else knew it. He turned his face to the window. That's what I wanted. I wanted someone else to say it. We sat in the silence that was the right thing for that moment, and from the window chairs I heard my mother make a small sound that she quickly swallowed. Part 5. Consequences in the last days. Things moved faster than I expected in the weeks after publication. The legal threat from Hargrove's law firm did not materialize into actual litigation. Defamation suits against accurately reported investigative journalism are expensive and tend to generate additional negative coverage, and they knew it. The American Water Works Association did not merely defer the Lifetime Achievement Award. 3 weeks after publication, they formally rescinded the nomination, declining to further consider Desmond Hargrove for any AWWA recognition, pending an independent review. The Ohio Attorney General's office opened a preliminary inquiry. This was not a prosecution. The age of the events and the deaths of several key figures made criminal liability almost certainly beyond the statute of limitations. But the inquiry triggered something else, a formal review of the 1983 Caldwell Falls investigation by the Ohio EPA at their own initiative. The EPA review was the one that mattered most. 2 months into that review, a contact inside the agency confirmed to me off the record that they had located original records of the 1982 to 1983 operational period at Caldwell Falls, including documentation not provided to the original investigators, documentation that included records of the threshold modifications. I published a follow-up piece, Ohio EPA Review Finds New Evidence, in 1983 Caldwell Falls contamination case. 2 weeks after that, the EPA issued a formal revised finding. The 1983 contamination event had been caused, at least in significant part, by unauthorized modifications to the water monitoring system's alert thresholds during the operational period under Hargrove Environmental Solutions Management. The original attribution to design deficiency was revised to inconclusive as to original design. It was not legally an exoneration of Walter Marsh by name, but it was unambiguously a refutation of the official record that had defined his life. The Ohio Engineering Board, whose predecessor organization had revoked Walter's license in 1984, initiated a review of his case. They were considering, my mother told me, with a voice doing a great deal of complicated work to sound steady, a formal, posthumous restoration of his license. It was the word posthumous that hit me. He was weaker when I arrived that afternoon. The decline had accelerated in the past 2 weeks. We were counting days now, but he was in a state of clarity, a sharpening, a final summoning of the self. I told him about the EPA's revised finding, about the engineering board. He listened with his eyes closed. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, what about the families, Caldwell Falls? The EPA review triggered a civil liability review by the state. It's preliminary. But the families, the ones who signed the NDAs, there may be additional remediation through the state's environmental fund. The NDAs were with Hargrove's company, not the state. The state isn't bound by them. He closed his eyes again. Good, he said. That's good. A long breath. And Desmond? Desmond Hargrove had stepped down quietly from the non-profit boards he'd served on. His company's municipal contracts were being reviewed by 3 Ohio jurisdictions. 2 had been suspended. His professional world was contracting. His reputation, carefully constructed over 4 decades, was developing fractures that would spread. It was not the complete destruction I had imagined in my darkest moments in the earliest days. The law moved slowly and imperfectly. Some things would never be fully adjudicated, but Desmond Hargrove would never receive a Lifetime Achievement Award. He would never again be described in any context without the shadow of Caldwell Falls. Every search of his name would return our article, the EPA's revised finding, the contract suspensions. He had built his life on a foundation that was now publicly understood to be fraudulent, and everyone in his world knew it. He'll never be free of it, I said. Not completely, not for the rest of his life. Walter opened his eyes. He looked at me. That, he said very quietly, is something. He slipped into unconsciousness on a Wednesday. He had been drifting in and out for 4 days, periods of clarity shorter, farther apart. On the Tuesday before that Wednesday, he was lucid one more time. I was alone with him. My mother had gone to the cafeteria. Phyllis was in the hallway. It was mid-afternoon, grey light through the window, the hospital quiet around us. He said my name. "I'm here," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. His breathing was slow and effortful, each breath a small act of will. "The envelope," he said. I had almost forgotten it. The small white envelope from December, the one he'd told me to open when I needed it, when I hit a wall, when I thought about giving up. I had carried it in my jacket for 3 months without opening it, which I now understood was exactly what he had expected me to do, what he had known I would do because he knew me. "I never opened it," I said. He made a sound that was surprise and satisfaction simultaneously. "Open it now," he said. I reached into my jacket. The envelope was not sealed. Inside was a single index card, the kind he had always used for notes, stiff and white and lined. His cramped engineer's handwriting in pencil. It said, "You were always the best thing, not the work, not the revenge, not the vindication. You, sitting in that chair, being there. Whatever happens, that's already enough." I sat very still for a long time. Then I looked up at him. He was watching me with an expression I'm not sure I have the language to describe accurately. Something between pride and peace, the face of a man who has said everything he needed to say and is ready now to be finished with saying things. "Grandpa," I said. "I know," he said. We didn't speak after that. I held his hand and he let me, and the afternoon light moved across the hospital floor. And after a while he was sleeping, and the sleeping had the deep, uncomplicated quality of someone who has put things down. He died the following evening, a Thursday at 6:17, with my mother and Phyllis and me in the room. It was quiet. It was the way people say they hope it will be, and it was. My mother put her hand over her mouth. Phyllis cried openly, in long, unashamed waves. I sat in that chair, the one that scraped, and held his hand, which was still warm, and was quiet. Epilogue: What remains 3 months after his death. The Ohio Engineering Board formally restored Walter Marsh's engineering license, posthumously, in a ceremony that my mother attended and I did not. She asked me not to, and I respected that because she and Walter had a complicated history and I thought she needed this one without me. She called me afterward, and her voice was the voice of someone who has found something they thought was gone. The civil review in Caldwell Falls resulted in the State of Ohio making additional payments to the surviving families and the estates of those who had died through the Environmental Remediation Fund. The amounts weren't public. I'd heard, through a source, that they were meaningful. I hoped they were. Hargrove Environmental Solutions lost 7 municipal contracts in the 6 months following our initial publication. They laid off 43 employees. There was reporting by the Columbus Dispatch suggesting the company was considering sale or dissolution. I did not write that story. That story belonged to someone else. Desmond Hargrove had not spoken publicly since his initial statement through the law firm. What he was living with now was his own to carry. Terence Burge called me on the day of the engineering board ceremony. "Does it help?" he asked. "Does it do anything?" "I think so," I said. "I think it does something. It doesn't bring those people back." "No, it doesn't." "But it says what happened," he said. "It says it officially. That matters. It has to matter." "It does?" I said. "I believe it does." Sylvia Okafor sent me a card. Inside it, in her small, precise handwriting, "I should have done this 30 years ago. I'm glad it happened at all." Caro Adeze published a technical paper in the Journal of Environmental Engineering examining the Caldwell Falls case as a study in post-installation modification risks and documentation standards. Walter's original patents were cited in the first paragraph. I went to his grave on a Sunday, 6 weeks after the funeral. It was May, finely warm, the grass at the cemetery startlingly green after the long grey winter. He was buried next to Ruth, whose headstone was already there, already weathered. I stood between them for a while. Walter Marsh was 31 years old when he designed the system that was taken from him. He was 34 when it was installed, he was 36 when the contamination event happened, and his name was placed on the failure. He spent 43 years after that carrying a story that was not accurately told. He was 79 when it was finally told correctly. That's 43 years of silence against however many years the accurate version now has to exist in the world. The accurate version will outlast everyone involved. It will be in public records, in a revised EPA finding, in an expert journal, in the index of a man's restored engineering license, in the memory of families in Caldwell Falls who were told for the first time that the man they had been led to blame had actually tried to warn them. I think about Walter telling me that from up high everything looks like a problem you could solve. I was 6 years old and he was on his shoulders at a county fair, and the Ferris wheel was turning, and the evening was warm and the whole world looked manageable from that height. He was wrong, I think, that everything is a problem you can solve. Some things you can only make less wrong. You can push the record closer to accurate, pull the truth closer to the surface, ensure that the people who should be accountable are, in some meaningful way, held to account. You can give a dying man the chance to know that his story will survive him. Not twisted, not buried, but something like true. That's not solving anything, but I've decided it's enough. I carried the index card with me for a long time afterward, in the inner pocket of every jacket I wore. You were always the best thing. I still have it now in a small frame on my bookshelf, between 2 technical books about water systems that I bought and read, cover to cover, not long after he died. The morning I finished reading the second one, I sat in the kitchen with my coffee and felt something I hadn't expected, something that took me a while to identify because I hadn't felt it much before, and it took time to recognize it in myself. It was pride, not in the story, not in the work, though I was proud of that too, but pride in him, in the man who had kept that folder for 46 years, who had never stopped knowing the truth even when no one would hear it, who had driven a delivery truck and built furniture in the garage and raised his daughters and held his marriage together and shown up at the county fair and put his 6-year-old grandson on his shoulders and told him that from up high things look solvable. Walter Marsh was a great engineer. He was also a great man. And now, finally, there is a public record that says so. I'm going to make sure it stays there for the ones who kept the folders, for the ones who waited